Good day and welcome to this weekly edition of Monckton's Monday Musings. And today I'm going to look at some of the supposed science of climate change that appears on the web. We're going to look in particular at a character called VERITASIUM. Now, VERITASIUM, veritas means truth, VERITASIUM therefore we might call it truthiness. And truthiness, of course, is not truth at all. It's a lie dressed up as truth. And he has a video which has had nearly 3 million hits, which talks about 13 so-called misconceptions about climate change. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to pick out some of the ones where he goes even more egregiously off-beam than usual. And he is a person who presents himself as somebody who's trying to give the scientific facts. But what, of course, you'll be getting from me is the scientific fact. So here goes. First of all, he says that the overall average temperature of the planet is warming, so global warming is technically correct. Well, there are a couple of things even wrong with that innocent-sounding statement. First of all, global warming isn't happening at anything like the rate they said it would. In fact, looking at the record of the Hadley Centre's data set of global temperature since 1950, when we first might have had an influence on global temperature, the rate of global warming is equivalent to only 1.2 Celsius in a century, about a third of what we were told by the IPCC that it was going to be. So we're not looking at rapid, dangerous warming, and nor are we looking at global warming. As my second slide will show you, there's been very little global warming in Antarctica. I've got the complete record from 1976 to 2010. I haven't got an updated record yet. And what that shows is that it's barely gone up at all. The temperature in Antarctica has remained more or less stable. What that means is that whatever warming we have seen, it isn't yet really global warming. And likewise, Central Africa hasn't shown much of an increase in temperature. But before I get to Central Africa, let's just have a look at how Arctic sea ice extent, we're told, has declined. What I'm going to show you in slide number 3 is that, yes, there's been a decline, but look how small that decline is when it's plotted against the seasonal variations every year. Now, that's the plot they don't want you to see. This is the actual Arctic temperatures, and you'll see our Arctic sea ice extent, rather, and you'll see how enormous the variations every year are compared with the very tiny decline in comparison over the last 30 years or so. Now, our Antarctic sea ice showing a similar record, slide 4, you'll see there's been no decline because there's been no warming of Antarctica, and if anything, a couple of years ago it reached a record high, about 2 million square kilometres, greater than had previously been observed since the satellites were watching. But now back to Central Africa, another part of the world that hasn't actually warmed. I've got a record here, again from about 1978 to 2007, and what that shows is no warming in the region of Mount Kilimanjaro at all. So whatever might temporarily have made some of the snow in Kilimanjaro disappear, it was nothing to do with global warming, because there hadn't been any global warming, and specifically no warming in the region of Central Africa over that period. Then we're told that there's going to be climate change is the new phrase. We can't talk about global warming because it isn't really happening. So VERITASIUM says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to get other things. There are going to be more intense storms, for instance. Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change set up a special working party on extreme weather, and it found there was no evidence for increased storminess as a result of global warming. It isn't happening. Likewise, he says we're going to get more intense droughts, and he says all these things twice. But again, the record, my slide number 6 from Howe et al., shows that for the last 30 years there's actually been a downtrend in the area of the global landmass that's under drought at any one time. And that's what you'd expect. With warmer weather you get more moisture in the atmosphere, and that means on the whole less drought. Then he says we're going to get more floods, but again the IPCC has said there is no particular evidence for a change in the amount of flooding worldwide as a result of global warming, and there's no particular reason to expect that it will be more frequent. You certainly can't at the same time claim there are going to be more floods and more droughts. That's not sensible, but that's what he does. Then he says ocean acidification. This is the backstop. When they realise it isn't going to warm as fast as they say, they're going to say, all right, ocean acidification. No global survey of the acid-base balance or pH score of the ocean has ever been undertaken. And the reason why is they know perfectly well what it would show if they did it, which is that it's hardly changing at all. You wouldn't expect it to change all that much because, as he says later in the video, if the weather gets warmer and the water gets warmer, then it outgasses CO2. And what does that do? That changes the pH in the opposite direction towards alkalinity. So this whole ocean acidification thing is based on a misunderstanding of how the science works. Well, then he says that 13 of the 14 hottest years occurred this century. Well, hottest since when? It was warmer in the medieval warm period than it is today. It was warm in the Roman warm period, warmer in the Minoan warm period, warmer in the Egyptian Old Kingdom warm period, warmer in the Holocene climate optimum or warm period, which persisted for 4,000 years with a short break in the middle, starting about 10,000 years ago and coming to 6,000 years ago. There is nothing at all unusual about today's temperatures, but of course VERITASIUM, truthiness, is never going to tell you that. And if we look at, for instance, the British temperature record, and we've got some going back to 1700, well, from 1693 until 1733, temperatures rose in central England, and that's a reasonably good proxy for worldwide temperatures, at a rate equivalent to 4 Celsius degrees per century, about twice the rate of warming, the maximum rate of warming we've seen for any 40-year period since then. So there's nothing unusual about the rate of global warming either. And in fact, looking at the Central England record, my slide 7, for 1995 until about 2014, I think it is, there's a 25-year period there with absolutely no global warming in central England at all. So once again, global warming not really happening. Then he says that, of course, if we use the satellite data, then we can see that the trend is continuing upwards. Well, actually, no, because for 18 years and 9 months, up until about 18 months ago, there had been no global warming at all, even though 1/3 of all man's potential influence on the climate had happened over the same period. And that again is something he doesn't tell you. Then he goes to the big scale, which of course is sea level rise. He says that sea level is rising at 3 millimetres a year. Well, I've got 1,000 years of sea level reconstructed records from Grinstead et al. In my slide number 9, and you'll see there I've compared it with Hubert Lamb's record of changes in global temperature, and they do kind of match, except that the sea level change over the last 1,000 years has been about 8 inches up and 8 inches down on where it is today. Sea level isn't going to change much under modern conditions, because most of the ice that might melt and go into the sea has already melted and gone into the sea thousands of years ago. And it's no surprise, therefore, to find that before the sea level record got tampered with, the altimetric mean sea level rise, as measured by the Aviso Envisat satellite, which has now failed, but during its 8 years in operation, it showed the sea level rising at 0.3 millimetres a year worldwide, 1/10 of the rate that we are told is happening by the people who manipulate the satellite data. And then he says, oh, well, we can't say this has anything to do with the sun because the sun's been getting dimmer since 1950. Well, no. Since roughly 1984 until 2001, there was a global brightening, which means more sunlight actually reaching the Earth. It's not just how bright the sun is, it's how much of the sunlight gets through to the surface and causes warming. And the answer is that about 2.3 watts per square metre of man-made forcings happened between 1750 and 2012, but just between 1984 and 2001. 2.9 watts per square metre of forcing were caused by the global brightening that Veritasium doesn't even know existed. He might care to read the paper on the subject by Dr. Rachel Pinker, published in 2005. Well, then he digs himself in further. He says water vapour in the atmosphere is increasing as well. Well, certainly, by one of the very few proven results in the slippery subject of climatology, yes, you can expect more water vapour in the atmosphere as it warms, because it has a greater carrying capacity, indeed a near exponentially carrying capacity for carrying water as it warms. However, not all the data sets show this, though again he doesn't tell you this. The International Satellite Cloud Climatology Project, my slide 12, shows that in fact there's no change in water vapour through most of the atmosphere, but up in the crucial mid-troposphere, where it is predicted that that's where we should see an increase in water vapour, particularly in the tropics, it's actually declined. There appears to be a negative feedback from water vapour on that data set. Water vapour is a very difficult thing to measure, not like CO2. It's not a well-mixed greenhouse gas. Its concentration varies enormously, both by latitude and by altitude. What we can say is that on average, if you took what's called an atmospheric column, then only 1 inch at the bottom of that column would represent all the water vapour all the way up that column. There isn't that much of it in the atmosphere. So then he says warming will increase the water vapour in the atmosphere and reduce the reflectivity of ice at the Earth's surface. Let's deal with the ice very quickly. The fact is that the albedo of the Earth, which is its capacity to reflect light back, doesn't have very much to do with the ice, particularly at the north and south poles, because the sun's rays come in at such a low angle there. The main reason for the reflectivity of the Earth is clouds. And the ice doesn't really make, I actually did a sum on this once, it makes virtually no difference. It has the equivalent difference to approximately 50 extra parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere over the last 100 years. It's very, very, very trivial. And then also, we have to look at what is really happening in this tropical mid-troposphere, because they predict what I have named, and it's now the generally used name for this, the hotspot, which is in the tropical mid-troposphere, about sort of 6 miles up. The rate of global warming should be approximately twice or even 3 times what it is at the surface. But the data sets simply don't show this differential rate of warming. And what that means again is the water vapour feedback is not all it's cracked up to be. And you can see that hotspot from the IPCC's fourth assessment report in my slide 13, and in slide 14 I show you the actual measurements of what the troposphere looks like, and showing no hotspot there at all. Then he says, what about the models? They're so accurate. Well, no, because 73 of 73 models based on this hotspot that doesn't exist predicted far more warming of that crucial tropical mid-troposphere, which is where most of the global warming we get from adding CO to the atmosphere is supposed to come to. They all exaggerate, all 73 of them exaggerate it, and my slide 15 will show you that, and the curious circumstance that the wider the gap between the predictions and the reality becomes, the more certain the IPCC is of its frankly wrong conclusions. So then Veritasium tells us it's a positive feedback loop, which is a bunch of different sources all indicate will lead to a 3 Celsius rise in temperature. Well, as we are about to disclose, they're all making elementary errors of feedback mathematics. Now, I don't know whether Veritasium has any knowledge of feedback mathematics. It's a very arcane subject, very few people do. I've been studying it over the last few years, and what I can reveal is that the response of temperature to a forcing in the presence of feedback is not a straight line, as climatology has assumed until now that it is. It is a curve, it's a hyperbola. And as a result, if you take the IPCC's long-standing canonical interval of 1.5 to 4.5 Celsius per doubling of CO2 as what they call the equilibrium sensitivity after the climate has settled back following the forcing from CO2, then they say, well, the mid-range estimate's going to be about 3 Celsius. No, it isn't, because the feedback response curve is a curve and not a straight line. It's 2.25 Celsius, and you'll actually see the exact curve on my slide 16, and you'll see how you get to 2.25 Celsius. You have to calculate it from the mid-range estimate of the feedback factor, run it up to the curve, and then read off the temperature from that. And that slide does that for you. But they've made another mistake, an even bigger mistake. When they do their feedback calculations in the climate models, they put in not the absolute pre-existing temperature as the input signal to the feedback loop calculation. They put only the change in temperature, which is 220 times too small. That makes the feedback factor 220 times too big, and that pushes it way to the right along the hyperbola to a point where it begins to get very steep indeed, and you appear to get very big changes in temperature for a very small change in the feedback factor. And you'll see that on my slide 17. But actually, what they should be doing is moving the whole calculation practically right to the left-hand end of the graph in slide 17. And I'm going to show you very briefly in slide 18 an electronic circuit as it is normally set up. You have an input line, you have an amplifier labelled mu at the top, then it comes down to the output node, then it goes back round the beta feedback or return loop back to the input node, and there's an output line as well. And although that's a simple diagram, actually working out the mathematics of what happens when you return some of the current back via a feedback is relatively complicated, and climatologists on the whole haven't really understood this. Well, we've shown how all the equations work, and we're writing a paper on this at the moment. And in slide 19, what you'll see is that because they're doing the calculations way to the wrong end of the curve, and they should be doing them right towards the left-hand end of the curve, we've actually had to blow up the region of the curve where they should be doing this because you can't see it otherwise. Then you get a much lower range of possible temperature changes, roughly from 1.8 to 2.7 Celsius, with a central estimate of about 2.25, instead of the much bigger spread that they imagine. And 2.7 becomes the maximum, and that's below what they say at the moment is the central estimate. Well, that's just an indication of some of the mathematics they've got wrong. They also have got the CO2 forcing wrong. They've exaggerated by 40%. And Professor William Happer has done some work on this and announced it 2 years ago at the World Federation of Scientists. So these are just a few of the points which VERITASIUM just doesn't seem to know about. He has trotted out very faithfully the Climate Communist Party line without having any understanding of just how wrong it is. And finally, he says it would be better if all species of the planet, and probably cheaper for us, if we started reducing emissions now rather than wait and pay the consequences later. Not a single economic paper that has been peer-reviewed that I've seen says that. If you do science by consensus, as most climate communists and VERITASIUM do, then the consensus in the economic peer-reviewed literature is that it's far cheaper to let global warming happen and adapt to its consequences later than to try to do anything whatsoever about it now. And in fact, I calculated and published a paper in the Journal of the World Federation of Scientists several years ago, pointing out that it was actually 10 to 100 times cheaper to leave this to future generations and not worry about it ourselves than it is for us to try to deal with it now. And that now becomes 100 to 1,000 times cheaper if you make the corrections to the feedback mathematics and to the CO2 forcing, which now will have to be made. And it's no surprise to us, therefore, that although the IPCC predicted that there should have been a rate of warming of about 0.75 Celsius from 1990, when they first made this prediction, until now, there's only been on average 0.4. And I show you this in graph number 20, my final graph for this slightly longer Monday musings than usual, because I wanted to go through some of these things in detail. And just one final point, and that is that Thunderfoot, who is another quite tendentious, often entertaining blogger on YouTube, has recently said, oh, look how terrible that all these nuclear bombs worth of extra radiation are knocking around in the atmosphere because we've added CO2 to the atmosphere. Well, the simplest answer to that is that in the first 11 years that we have of a reasonably detailed record of the temperature of the top 1.25 miles of the ocean. The ocean is warming at a rate equivalent only to 1 Celsius degrees every 430 years. That's how little all those supposed atom bombs worth of radiation actually make any difference to temperature, given how very, very large the planetary heat sink that is the ocean happens to be. So let's put some of these pieces of bad and bogus science into perspective, and let us hope that Veritasium in future does a little more homework than just ringing up his local Communist Party or the Democrat Party, they seem to be the same these days, and asking what the party line is. Instead, let him do some proper science and try and work out what's really happening. Let him get in touch with me. Let him ask for a copy of my paper which explains how official climatology has exaggerated climate sensitivity, as it's called, for 20 years, and then 40 years in fact, and then once he has understood the error of their ways, and he's understood that the Climate Communist Party line, to which he has so unfailingly adhered so far, is simply wrong, then perhaps he'll make another video saying, "Okay, mate, it's a fair cop. The scare is over." Thank you very much for listening, and God bless you all.